They laughed before he even said a word. And in that moment, they had no idea they were laughing at the man who would soon control their entire careers. The roll call room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old paper, the kind of place where routines never changed and respect was measured by years on the badge, not the man wearing it. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a cold, pale glow across rows of worn chairs filled with officers who had seen it all, or at least believed they had. Conversations overlapped in low murmurs until the door creaked open, and for a brief second, the room shifted its attention. He stepped in quietly, a tall black officer in a clean, pressed uniform, his posture straight, his expression calm, almost unreadable. No one greeted him. No one nodded. Instead, a few exchanged glances, subtle at first, then not so subtle. A smirk formed on Officer Ryan Cole's face as he leaned back in his chair, boots stretched out just enough to block the aisle. "You lost, rookie," he called out, loud enough for half the room to hear. A ripple of chuckles followed, soft at first, then building as others joined in, sensing easy entertainment. The new officer didn't respond. He simply paused, just for a second, his eyes scanning the room as if memorizing every face, every voice, every reaction. Then he stepped forward, adjusting his path without asking anyone to move. That only made it worse. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Ryan added, sitting up now, his tone sharper, more deliberate. "You don't just walk in here like you own the place." More laughter. Someone in the back muttered, "Guest standards really did drop this year." And that drew another wave, louder this time, echoing off the walls. The room fed on it, the kind of energy that turns small moments into public performances. Still, the man said nothing. He reached an empty spot near the front and stood there, hands loosely at his sides, breathing steady, like he wasn't standing in the middle of a room that had already decided who he was. Ryan exchanged a glance with Officer Jake Turner, a silent agreement passing between them, the kind built on habit. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What's your name, man?" he asked, not out of courtesy, but challenge. The room quieted just enough to hear the answer, anticipation hanging in the air like a held breath. The officer finally spoke, his voice even, controlled. "Marcus Hale." Ryan nodded slowly, repeating the name like it didn't belong there. "Marcus Hale," he said, then smirked. "Well, Marcus, around here, you earn respect. You don't just walk in expecting it." A few heads nodded. A few more chuckled. It was familiar, predictable, comfortable for them. But Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just looked at Ryan for a moment, not with anger, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Something quieter. Something heavier. "Are you done?" he asked, his tone calm, almost indifferent. The question hung there, slicing through the noise in a way none of them expected. For a split second, the room hesitated. Then Ryan laughed again, louder than before, forcing the moment back into his control. "Oh, he's got jokes," he said, leaning back again, the grin returning to his face. And just like that, the room followed him, the laughter swelling once more, unaware that everything they thought they understood about this moment was about to change. The laughter did not fade. It settled into the walls like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for someone exactly like him to walk through that door. And Marcus Hale stood in the center of it without moving, without reacting, as if the noise around him had nothing to do with him at all, as if he had already heard it before in different rooms, different cities, different uniforms. Ryan leaned forward again, resting his forearms on his knees, eyes locked on Marcus with that same confident arrogance that came from years of never being challenged. "Let me give you some advice, Marcus," he said slowly, drawing out the name. "Around here, you listen more than you talk, especially when you are the new guy." A few officers nodded, others smirked, the room aligning itself behind him without question. Marcus tilted his head slightly, not submissive, not confrontational, just observant, like he was taking note of something no one else could see. "I hear you," he replied calmly, and that only seemed to irritate Ryan more, because it was not the reaction he wanted. It was not defensive, not emotional, not weak. It was controlled, and control in that room felt out of place when it came from someone they had already decided did not belong. Jake let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Man, you sound like you practiced that in the mirror," he said, and a few more chuckles followed. But this time there was a slight hesitation underneath it, subtle, almost invisible, like the rhythm had been thrown off just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Marcus did not look at Jake. He did not look at anyone else. His gaze stayed steady, forward, grounded, and for a moment, it felt like the room was adjusting to him rather than the other way around. But Ryan was not finished. He pushed himself up from his chair and stepped closer, closing the distance just enough to make it personal. "You know what your problem is," he said, lowering his voice slightly, forcing those nearby to lean in to catch every word. "You walked in here like you already had a place, like you earned something." He paused, letting that hang. "You did not." The silence stretched just a second longer than expected, and in that second, something shifted, not in the room, but in the space between them. Marcus finally turned his head fully toward Ryan, meeting his eyes directly, and there was no anger there, no fear, just a quiet certainty that did not match the role they had assigned him. "You are right," Marcus said, his voice steady, measured. "I did not come here to earn a place from you." The words landed differently than anything before, not louder, not sharper, but heavier, like they carried something unseen beneath them. Ryan's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but enough for Sergeant Linda Brooks, standing near the back with a clipboard in her hand, to glance down at the roster she had been holding, her eyes scanning the printed names again, slower this time, more carefully, her brow tightening just slightly, as if something was not lining up the way it should. She looked back up at Marcus, then back at the page, then at the front door, as if waiting for something she could not yet explain. The room, however, pushed forward, unwilling to lose momentum. "So what? You think you are different," Jake added, trying to pull the energy back. "You think you are better than the rest of us." Marcus exhaled quietly, almost unnoticeable, his shoulders relaxed, his stance unchanged. "No," he said simply. "I think I am exactly where I am supposed to be." And this time the silence that followed was not broken immediately. It lingered, just long enough to make a few people shift in their seats, just long enough for the confidence in the room to crack, not loudly, not completely, but enough to let something else seep in, something unfamiliar, something they did not yet have a name for. And somewhere near the back, Sergeant Brooks closed the folder halfway, her fingers tightening around it as she looked toward the door again, because now she was certain something was coming. The room did not recover the same way it had before. The laughter that once filled the space now felt thinner, forced, like it was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away, and Ryan could feel it even if he refused to acknowledge it. He straightened his shoulders and glanced around, as if checking whether the others were still with him. And they were, mostly, but not as confidently as before, not as unified. "You talk like you have been here before," Ryan said, his voice louder now, trying to pull the room back under his control. "But you have not earned anything in this precinct." A few officers nodded again, but slower this time, their attention no longer just on Ryan, but shifting back and forth between him and Marcus, measuring something they could not quite define. Marcus did not step back. He did not step forward. He simply stood there, grounded, like the floor beneath him belonged to him just as much as anyone else, maybe more, and that subtle difference began to press into the edges of the room, creating a quiet tension that no one could laugh away. Sergeant Brooks took a step closer to the front, her clipboard now fully closed, her eyes moving from Marcus to Ryan, then to the door again. Her instincts, sharpened by years of experience, were telling her that this moment was not random, it was not ordinary, and whatever was about to happen was already in motion. Ryan exhaled sharply and let out a short laugh, forcing it. "You know what? I will make this simple for you," he said, taking one more step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal again. "You follow orders, you keep your head down, and maybe, just maybe, you last here." The words were meant to land like authority, but something in the air rejected them. Something in Marcus's stillness made them sound smaller than they were intended to be. Marcus met his gaze without hesitation, and for the first time, Ryan hesitated, not visibly, not enough for anyone to call out, but enough for the rhythm of the room to miss a beat. "I understand how this works," Marcus said, his voice even, calm, almost quiet, but it carried across the room in a way that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. I just think you misunderstand what is about to happen. The sentence did not rise in volume. It did not demand attention, but it pulled it anyway, like gravity, like something inevitable. A few officers shifted in their seats. One cleared his throat, another adjusted his posture, small movements that betrayed a growing awareness that something was off. Something was not lining up with the script they were used to. And then it happened, not with noise, not with warning, but with a simple sound that cut through everything. The door opened, not slammed, not forced, just opened with quiet authority, and every head in the room turned at once. The chief stepped inside, his presence filling the space without needing to say a word. Conversations died instantly. The remaining laughter vanished like it had never been there, and even Ryan straightened instinctively, stepping back half a step without realizing it. The chief's eyes moved across the room slowly, taking in the officers, the tension, the arrangement, and finally resting on Marcus. And in that moment, something clicked into place for Sergeant Brooks. Her posture stiffened, her grip on the clipboard tightening as recognition settled in. The chief walked forward with measured steps, stopping near the front, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of command that no one questioned. "Settle down," he said, though the room was already silent. And then he turned slightly, gesturing toward Marcus without looking at him immediately, letting the moment stretch, letting the silence deepen, until it became impossible to ignore. "I see introductions have already started," he added, his tone neutral. But there was something underneath it, something that made a few officers glance at each other uneasily. Ryan swallowed subtly, his confidence no longer as solid as it had been just minutes ago. And Marcus remained exactly where he was, unchanged, unaffected, as if this moment had always been waiting for him, as if everything that had just happened was not a surprise, but a step. And the chief finally looked directly at him, then back at the room, drawing in a slow breath before speaking again. And when he did, every person in that room felt it before they even understood it, felt the shift, felt the weight of what was about to be said, because the room had changed, and they were just now realizing it. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the room like something alive, pressing against every officer standing there. And the chief let it linger just long enough for the weight of it to settle in their chests before he spoke again. "Let us reset," he said calmly, his voice steady, controlled, the kind of tone that did not need volume to command attention. His eyes moved once more across the room, briefly stopping on Ryan, then Jake, then a few others who suddenly found the floor more interesting than they had a moment ago. And finally, he turned fully toward Marcus. "Some of you seem confused about who just walked into this room," he continued, and there was no anger in his voice, no raised edge, just clarity. And that made it worse, because clarity left no room to hide. Ryan felt his throat tighten slightly, his posture shifting without permission, as if his body understood something his mind was still trying to deny. Sergeant Brooks stood completely still now, her suspicion confirmed, her earlier unease replaced with quiet certainty. The chief took one slow step forward, placing himself beside Marcus but not overshadowing him, not interrupting him, just aligning with him. "This is not a new officer trying to find his place," he said, pausing deliberately, allowing every word to land, to echo, to settle. "This is the man who now defines it." The room did not react immediately. It could not, because the words had not fully registered yet, not logically, not emotionally. They hung in the air like something unreal, something that did not match what they had just witnessed. And then the chief delivered the final line. Simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. "Captain Marcus Hale," he said, turning his head slightly toward Marcus. "Your commanding officer." And that was the moment everything collapsed, not loudly, not dramatically, but internally, silently, like a structure that had been standing on false assumptions finally giving way under its own weight. Ryan's expression froze. The confidence that had filled his face minutes ago drained away, replaced by something unfamiliar, something unsteady. Jake blinked, his earlier grin gone, his posture stiffening as he tried to recalibrate. Officers who had laughed just moments ago now stood still, eyes shifting, minds racing to replay what had just happened, what they had said, how they had acted, because now every word carried a different meaning. Every laugh echoed differently in their memory, and Marcus did not move right away. He let it sit, He let the silence return, but this time it was not empty. It was full of realization, full of consequence, full of something they could not undo. And when he finally stepped forward, it was not rushed, not aggressive, just deliberate, controlled. He moved past Ryan without brushing him, without acknowledging him directly, but the absence of acknowledgement carried more weight than any confrontation could have. He reached the front of the room and turned to face them. The same officers, the same room, the same people, but everything had changed. "We will try this again," Marcus said, his voice calm, steady. And every ear in that room was locked on him now, not because they were told to listen, but because they had to, because the reality in front of them demanded it. "Roll call starts with respect," he continued, his eyes moving across the room, not lingering on anyone too long, but not avoiding anyone either. "Not because of rank," he added, pausing slightly, "but because of who we choose to be when no one is watching." The words settled differently than the chiefs had. They did not announce authority, they defined it, and that distinction made the room feel smaller, tighter, more honest. Ryan swallowed, his hands shifting at his sides as he avoided eye contact. For the first time since Marcus had entered, he had nothing to say, nothing to add, nothing to control, because control was no longer his to hold. And Marcus let the silence sit one more time before giving a single, simple instruction: "Stand straight." He said, not loudly, not sharply, just clearly, and one by one, without hesitation, without resistance. The room adjusted, shoulders squared, postures corrected, eyes forward, and in that quiet transformation, something deeper than authority took shape, something earned without asking, something understood without explanation. And as Marcus looked at them, not with pride, not with anger, but with expectation, the lesson had already begun, long before anyone was ready for it. The room held its shape, but something inside it had shifted permanently, like a line had been drawn that no one could pretend not to see anymore. And Marcus stood at the front with a presence that did not demand attention, yet commanded it completely, his hands resting naturally at his sides, his posture steady, his eyes moving across each officer with quiet precision, not searching for weakness, not looking for guilt, but measuring something deeper, something that could not be faked. "Roll call," he said simply, and the word carried a new weight now, no longer routine, no longer automatic. Sergeant Brooks stepped forward slightly, her voice more formal than before as she began reading names, one by one, each officer responding with a firm acknowledgement. Voices that had once blended into casual noise now sounded sharper, more deliberate, as if each person was recalibrating in real time, trying to find their footing in a room that no longer operated under the same rules. Marcus listened without interruption, his attention unwavering, and when the last name was called, he took a step forward, just enough to close the distance between him and the front row. "Before assignments," he said, his tone calm, controlled, "we are going to address something." No one moved, no one spoke. Even the smallest sounds seemed to disappear. Ryan stood near the center, his shoulders squared but tense, his gaze fixed forward, avoiding Marcus without making it obvious. And Marcus did not call him out, not directly, not by name. Instead, he addressed the room as a whole. "What happened in here a few minutes ago," he continued, "is not just about one person." His eyes moved slowly across them, making sure the message did not land on just one target. "It is about culture." The word settled heavily, unfamiliar in that space when spoken like this. "And culture is not what we say we are," he added, pausing slightly. "It is what we show when we think it does not matter." A few officers shifted subtly, the weight of that sentence pressing into them in ways they could not ignore. Marcus took another step, his presence filling the room without raising his voice. "Every badge in this room represents trust," he said, "not just from the public, but from each other." His gaze briefly passed over Ryan, not stopping, not lingering, but not avoiding either. "And the moment we decide who deserves that trust based on assumption," he continued, "we lose more than respect, we lose direction." The silence that followed was not empty. It was reflective, uncomfortable in a way that forced thought rather than reaction. Sergeant Brooks lowered her eyes slightly, absorbing every word, while Jake's jaw tightened, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to self-awareness. Marcus let the moment breathe before continuing. I did not step into this role to prove anything to you, he said, his tone steady, grounded. And you do not need to prove anything to me through words. He paused, just long enough to let that distinction settle. You prove it through how you show up. His voice did not rise, but it sharpened slightly, not in anger, but in clarity. Every call, every report, every interaction, he added. That is where this department defines itself. Ryan shifted his weight, his hands tightening briefly at his sides before relaxing again. The tension inside him visible now even without a word spoken. Marcus noticed, but he did not expose it. He did not isolate him, because this was not about a single moment. It was about what came after. We are going to move forward, Marcus said, stepping back slightly to reset the space. But understand this. His eyes swept across the room one more time. What you showed today does not disappear. The words landed with quiet finality, not as a threat, not as punishment, but as truth. It becomes part of what we build from, he finished. And in that moment, the room understood something they had not expected to learn, that accountability did not always come with volume. Sometimes it came with stillness, with clarity, with a mirror held up in silence. And as Marcus nodded once, signaling the continuation of roll call, the room responded differently now, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because the man they had dismissed minutes ago was no longer someone they could define. He was someone who had already defined the standard they would now be measured against. The shift did not end when the words stopped. It lingered, settling into every corner of the room as assignments began to roll out. Names paired with locations, units dispatched across neighborhoods measured in blocks and miles. The routine continuing, but no longer untouched by what had just happened. Marcus stood at the front, listening, observing, his presence no longer questioned but not yet fully understood. And that space between recognition and understanding created a quiet tension that followed every movement, every glance, every word. Sergeant Brooks moved through the list with steady precision, her voice clear, her tone aligned now with the structure Marcus had just redefined. Unit 12, downtown. Patrol, she called, and the officer responded without hesitation, sharper than before, more grounded, as if the expectation in the room had recalibrated the way they carried themselves. Ryan remained still, his name not yet called, his thoughts louder than the room itself, replaying the moment over and over, the words he had chosen, the tone he had used, the certainty he had felt, all of it now sitting differently. Heavier, less certain, he kept his eyes forward, but his awareness had shifted. Inward, measuring himself against a standard he had not expected to face. Unit 17. Brooks continued, and the rhythm of roll call carried on, but beneath it, something else was building, not loud, not obvious, but present, a silent adjustment in how each officer now understood their place, their role, their responsibility. Marcus finally stepped forward again as the last assignment was given, not interrupting, not rushing, just entering the space with quiet authority. Before you move out, he said, and every movement in the room paused instantly, not out of fear, but out of attention, because now, his voice meant something different. It carried consequence, not imposed, but recognized. There is one more thing, he added, his gaze steady, his tone unchanged. Leadership is not about being the loudest voice in the room, he said, and the words landed with quiet precision. It is about being the most consistent one. A few officers shifted slightly, absorbing that in their own way. Consistency builds trust, he continued, and trust is the only thing that holds a team together when everything else is uncertain. His eyes moved again, not searching for reaction, but ensuring presence, ensuring that no one could say they did not hear. What happened earlier, he said, referencing the moment without naming it, was inconsistent with what this department is supposed to represent. The room remained silent, but this silence was different. It was not defensive, it was reflective. Marcus let that settle before continuing. We are not here to compete with each other, he said. We are here to support each other, especially when it is not easy. His voice did not rise, but it sharpened slightly with intention. Because the public does not see individuals, he added, they see one uniform. That sentence lingered, pressing into something deeper than procedure, something tied to identity, to responsibility. Ryan felt it more than most, his jaw tightening slightly as the realization continued to unfold. Not forced, not demanded, but undeniable. Marcus paused, then took a small step back, resetting the space once more. "You will be tested out there," he said. "Not just in how you respond to calls, but in how you treat each other when no one is watching." His eyes moved across the room one final time, steady, unwavering. "That is where this job is defined," he finished, and for a moment, no one moved, as if the room needed to catch up to what had just been said. And then, slowly, the motion returned, chairs shifted, radios adjusted, officers preparing to step out into the day. But something was different now, something subtle yet undeniable. Ryan finally lifted his eyes, just briefly, just enough to glance toward Marcus. And for the first time, there was no smirk, no challenge, just recognition, quiet and unspoken. And Marcus acknowledged it without a word, not with a nod, not with a gesture, just with presence. Because sometimes the most powerful response is not spoken, it is understood. And as the officers began to file out, one by one, the room emptied of noise but filled with something else, something that would not leave with them, something that would follow them into every call, every interaction, every moment where choice defined character. And Marcus remained for a second longer, standing in the same place where he had first been judged, now transformed into the place where the standard had been set, not by force, not by rank alone, but by the quiet certainty of someone who never needed to prove who he was, because he already knew. The hallway outside the roll call room carried a different kind of silence, not empty, but thoughtful. As officers moved toward their assignments with quieter steps, radios clipped, duty belts adjusted, the usual morning rhythm continuing, but no longer untouched, and Ryan lingered just outside the doorway for a second longer than the others, his hand resting briefly against the cool metal frame, as if grounding himself in a moment he could not fully shake. The echoes of his own voice still replaying in his mind, louder now than they had been when he spoke them, sharper now that he understood who had heard them. He exhaled slowly, straightened his uniform, and stepped forward into the corridor, but his pace was slower, more deliberate, as if something inside him was recalibrating with each step. Jake caught up beside him, glancing over with a half-formed expression that never quite turned into a joke. "Man," he started, then stopped, the words falling away before they could take shape, because whatever he might have said before no longer fit the moment. Ryan gave a short nod, not in agreement, not in dismissal, just acknowledgement, and they walked on in silence, something that had rarely happened between them before. Outside, the morning air was cool, crisp, stretching across the parking lot where patrol cars lined up in rows, engines turning over, doors opening and closing, the city waiting just beyond the gates. And as Ryan approached his unit, he paused again, just briefly, his reflection catching in the side mirror, the badge on his chest gleaming under the early light. But it looked different now, not because it had changed, but because his understanding of it had. He reached for the door handle, then stopped, his grip loosening as he thought back to Marcus's words. Not the authority in them, but the clarity, the consistency, the quiet expectation that did not demand respect, but made its absence obvious. And for the first time, Ryan felt the weight of something he had never considered before, not rank, not discipline, but responsibility in its simplest form. He opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, the familiar feel of the steering wheel grounding him. But even that felt slightly different, like the beginning of something he had not chosen but could no longer ignore. Across the lot, Sergeant Brooks stood near her vehicle, watching the officers disperse, her gaze thoughtful, analytical. She had seen shifts like this before, small moments that did not look like much on the surface but carried lasting impact. And she knew this was one of them, not because of what had been said, but because of how it had been received. She glanced back toward the building, toward the door Marcus had not yet walked through, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod, recognizing the kind of leadership that did not announce itself loudly but reshaped everything around it. Inside, Marcus remained in the room just a little longer, the chairs now empty, the noise gone, replaced by a stillness that felt earned, not forced. He walked slowly across the space, his steps measured, his eyes taking in the room not as it had been, but as it could become, the echoes of earlier laughter no longer holding power, replaced instead by something quieter, something more grounded. He reached the front again, pausing where he had first stood, the exact spot where he had been judged without introduction, and he let that moment sit, not with resentment, not with pride, but with understanding, because moments like that were not rare, they were familiar, and what mattered was not that they happened, but what followed. He turned toward the door and stepped out into the hallway, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, and as he moved through the corridor, a few officers who had already begun their shift glanced his way, their reaction subtle but different. A nod here, a straightened posture there, small. Acknowledgments that had not existed before, and Marcus returned them in the same way. Minimal, respectful, consistent, because leadership, as he had said, was not about being seen once. It was about being seen the same way every time. Outside, the day had fully begun, the city moving, the work waiting, and as Marcus stepped into the light, there was no announcement, no grand gesture, just a continuation, because the real shift had already happened, not in the words, not in the reveal, but in the space between who they thought he was and who he had shown himself to be. And that space, once filled with assumption, was now filled with something else entirely, something that would follow them long after this. Morning ended. The city moved like it always did, steady and indifferent, traffic flowing through intersections measured in seconds and blocks, radios crackling with routine calls that filled the air with familiar codes. And yet for Ryan, nothing felt routine anymore. He drove through his assigned sector with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, but his mind kept returning to that room, to that moment when everything shifted without warning, when the person he had dismissed became the person who defined him. He slowed at a red light, the glow reflecting faintly across his windshield, and for a brief second, the world outside felt quieter than usual, like it was giving him space to think, something he had not allowed himself to do before. His radio buzzed, dispatch assigning a minor call just a few blocks away. Nothing urgent, nothing unusual, but even as he acknowledged it, his tone was different, more measured, more aware. Like every word now carried weight he had never considered before. He arrived within minutes, stepping out of the vehicle and scanning the area. The situation simple, controlled, the kind of call that required presence more than action. And as he approached, he noticed something he might have overlooked before. The way people watched, not just what he did, but how he did it. The way his posture, his tone, his choices shaped their perception in real time. And without thinking, he adjusted, not dramatically, not for show, but subtly, intentionally, his voice calmer, his movements clearer, more deliberate, because now he understood that the uniform did not speak for itself. He did, and that realization stayed with him even after the call ended. Back at the precinct, the day continued to unfold, officers moving in and out, reports filed, conversations held in lower tones than usual, the earlier energy replaced by something more controlled, more thoughtful. Sergeant Brooks sat at her desk reviewing paperwork, her pen moving steadily across the page, but her attention occasionally drifting toward the hallway, where footsteps echoed with a different rhythm now, not rushed, not careless, but aligned. She recognized the pattern, not perfect, not complete, but beginning, and that was enough. Marcus moved through the building with the same steady presence, stopping briefly to speak with officers, not to correct, not to command, but to observe, to listen. His questions simple, direct, focused on clarity rather than authority, and each interaction, no matter how brief, carried the same consistency he had spoken about earlier, the same standard applied without variation. And that consistency began to build something invisible but real, something that did not need to be announced to be felt. Ryan returned later that afternoon, stepping back into the precinct with a quieter energy than when he had left, his movements more controlled, his awareness sharper. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room, not out of habit, but intention, and his eyes landed on Marcus, who stood near the far side speaking with another officer, the conversation calm, professional, grounded. There was no performance in it, no need to assert control, and that, more than anything, stayed with Ryan. He walked past without interruption, but this time, as he passed, he gave a slight nod, small, almost unnoticeable, but real, and Marcus returned it just as simply. no more, no less. Because acknowledgement did not need to be loud to be understood, and as Ryan continued on, something settled inside him, not completely, not all at once, but enough to mark a shift. Because the lesson had not been delivered through punishment or force, it had been revealed through contrast, through the space between who he thought he was and who he chose to be next, and that space, once ignored, was now impossible to overlook. And as the day moved forward, one call at a time, one interaction at a time, that quiet shift continued, not announced, not celebrated, but lived, in the way voices were used, in the way eyes met, in the way decisions were made when no one stopped to question them. Because sometimes the most powerful change does not come from being told what is right. It comes from seeing it clearly enough that you can no longer choose anything else. The day did not end with a dramatic moment. It ended the way most days do, slowly, quietly, with the sun lowering over the city and the last of the calls fading into routine reports and closing notes. But something had changed, not in the streets, not in the buildings, but in the people who moved through them. Ryan sat in his patrol car as the sky shifted from pale blue to a deeper shade, the dashboard clock ticking forward, marking the hours he had spent moving through his shift with a different awareness than ever before. He rested his hands on the wheel for a moment longer than necessary, not because he was tired, but because he was thinking, replaying not just what had happened that morning, but how he had responded since, the choices he had made, the tone he had used, the way he had carried himself when no one was watching. And for the first time, he was not measuring himself against other officers. He was measuring himself against something internal, something quieter, something more demanding. Back at the precinct, lights hummed softly as reports were finalized. Chairs pushed in, lockers closed. The usual end of shift rhythm unfolding. But the conversations were different now. Not louder, not forced, just more aware, as if each word carried a little more intention than it had before. Sergeant Brooks finished her paperwork and set her pen down, her eyes drifting across the room, observing the subtle changes, the way officers spoke to each other, the way they listened, the way they paused before responding, small things, but real things, and she recognized what it meant, not perfection, not immediate transformation, but direction. Marcus stood near the front desk, reviewing a report with quiet focus, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, the same as it had been that morning. And that consistency was what anchored everything else. He did not need to remind anyone of what had happened. He did not need to repeat his words, because the standard had already been set, and it was now visible in the smallest details. Ryan entered the building shortly after, his steps measured, his expression thoughtful, and as he moved through the room, he noticed the difference, not just in others, but in himself. He approached the desk, placing his report down with care, and for a brief moment, he hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition. Then he looked toward Marcus, meeting his gaze directly this time. No hesitation, no avoidance, just clarity. "Report is complete, sir," he said, his voice steady, respectful, and Marcus gave a slight nod, acknowledging the words without adding to them, because nothing more was needed. And as Ryan turned to leave, something settled inside him, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet truth he could not ignore. That respect had never been about who walked into the room first, or who spoke the loudest, or who had been there the longest. It was about who remained the same when everything else shifted, who carried themselves with consistency when it mattered most. And as the last of the officers stepped out into the evening, the building grew quiet again, the echoes of the day fading into stillness. But the impact of that morning did not fade with it. It stayed, in the way they would show up tomorrow and the day after that, in the way they would choose to see each other, not through assumption, not through habit, but through something earned, something understood. And as the lights dimmed and the doors closed, the lesson remained, simple, clear, and impossible to forget. He thought he understood what respect looked like, until the man he dismissed showed him what it truly meant.